This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. A whistleblower reveals the inside story on prison corruption. A former prison teacher and the wife of the Boonie Hat Bandit takes on the prison system, and the appeal of her husband just denied. Corruption in corrections tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Carolyn Giammanco met Keith Giammanco, a.k.a. the Boonie Hat Bandit, in prison, where she taught inmates the GED high school equivalency degree program. Her book, Banknotes, The True Story of the Boonie Hat Bandit, told the bank robbery story. Also the author of Guilty Hearts, The World of Prison Romances, and her latest work, which we talk about tonight, Inside the Death Fences, Memoir of a Whistleblower. Our third show related to the Boonie Hat Bandit case. And to refresh our listeners, Keith Giammanco was a successful stock options trader, single father of twin daughters, suffered financial ruin during the Great Recession, and in a desperate move, Keith made the decision to rob 12 banks, became notoriously known as the Boonie Hat Bandit, ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison. His appeal just rejected by the courts. Welcome back, Caroline, friend of the show. Good to talk to you.
It's good to be back on, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Okay, why don't we start right off. Describe what the basis for the appeal and the latest on what happened.
There were actually several points that were being argued in the appeal. And the heart of it was that Keith was convicted twice for the exact same crimes. We were hoping to have the court make some decisions in a positive way against the use of dual sovereignty, which takes away citizens' double jeopardy protections. But unfortunately, that didn't happen.
And did you assume that there was very low odds to begin with?
There's always very low odds in an appeal. Yeah. We were hopeful, but the system's really not set up to let people lose.
All right, let me ask this. Was incompetent counsel any part of that appeal?
Yes, it was. Because,
it's a big story here in Connecticut that Michael Skakel, with $1 million defense, actually, against all odds, had his conviction overturned because of incompetent counsel.
Yeah, and it just seems crazy to those of us who've ever had a situation where our loved one had to deal with subpar representation that somebody with $1 million lawyer could claim ineffective counsel. Anyone in Missouri who has had to use a public defender, something that many people don't know is that the head of the public defender office, the head for the entire state office here in Missouri, his name is Michael Barrett, wrote a report saying that every single person who's ever had to use a public defender in the state should automatically be awarded an ineffective counsel decision, because the workload and the very little time that anybody gets to spend on any given case in his office, he said it's obvious that someone who has a private attorney or the prosecution, which has full-time people working just on that case, it's not to the advantage of anybody who's ever had to rely on his office. Not
only that, but Keith actually had lawyers who wanted him convicted, right? I mean, they weren't even really defending him.
Right, exactly. And we talk about that in my first book, Banknotes. His pro bono attorneys, which means they were volunteering to do it for free, they wanted the publicity of the case, but they wanted him to just play dead, basically, and let the system, do whatever it was going to do to him. And when he said, no, I want to fight this, especially the double jeopardy issue, he agreed that he expected them to do anything, and one of his attorneys actually told him that he was going to make sure that Keith spent the rest of his life in prison.
Did the ruling explain in any reason why the double jeopardy appeal was rejected?
It used case law, previous case law, as their explanation for it. It was pretty much a cookie-cutter answer that they gave him. In fact, in for one of the claims, the judge in her decision said she was procedurally barring that claim because she said he hadn't claimed it sooner. He should have claimed it right away. What's crazy about that is he had. From his very first appeal forward, He always claimed that. So I don't think that the appeals system is really trying to protect citizens' rights because they don't put a wholehearted effort into being balanced. It's pretty much if you're convicted, you're going to stay that way. And in the state of Missouri, we've had some pretty high-profile cases of wrongful convictions where DNA has proven that somebody didn't do something, and the state still doesn't want to let them loose.
Wow. All right. I had asked if Keith wanted to make a statement to us in any way, and apparently you have something.
Yes, I do. Keith says, I have many things to say about the federal district court's denial of my habeas corpus. But for now, just this. It's another piece added to the coffin of the United States Constitution, another piece of case law to separate us from the Constitution. It's another victory for the lopsided Missouri court system. The appeals process is geared toward the power of the state and not toward the citizens. We will keep fighting this breach of our constitutional rights until we stop the practice of double jeopardy and other regular violations of people's constitutional rights within our state and nation.
I always say how articulate he is. How much time left does he have now before he can get out?
He has 7.5 years before he's eligible for parole, and he has 10 years if he has to do the entire sentence.
And his age right now is?
54.
54.
And he's already been in for 10 years.
Wow, he's done 10 years?
Yeah.
Wow. So, wow.
Thank you.
How was his morale?
Some days okay, some days not so okay.
It's obviously not a sympathetic cause for, the average guy to say, well, this guy went and robbed banks. But it's such a waste having him in prison at this stage because of his, his talent and everything, and there was no violence and all of that. It's tough to reconcile for you guys, isn't it?
It is. And our argument about, well, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime, is that he's already completed his federal sentence. That should have been enough.
Oh, so he's actually on the state sentence now?
Yes.
Boy, amazing. The scandal and the resignation of Governor Greitens there, how has that affected you guys?
Well, Governor Greitens was the first governor, Democrat or Republican, who had spoken up seriously about criminal justice reform and the need to overhaul our prison system. And that disappeared as soon as his legal problems started. All the focus went towards him trying to retain his position as governor, and then it ended up with him resigning in shame. So it is a setback to criminal justice reform. We had also hoped that he might be open to our clemency effort, and so we have had to start all over again because it's a new governor we have.
Boy, he's had a lot of bad luck. Let's jump into corruption in corrections, which is obviously the subject of your new book. First of all, when you wrote that, did you have any concern that it would have blowback on Keith?
No more so than what we wrote about in banknotes. We have spoken out against the corruption in the system for years now. Okay. And we kind of feel like if we are too afraid to speak up about things, then nothing's going to change. The corruption's not going to go away if people just stay quiet. And that's part of the problem in our Missouri system and probably other systems is that I know as an employee there's a culture of fear and intimidation, and people are afraid to say anything. Even when it became a little bit safer when the news articles and the pitch came out at the end of 2016 that kind of peeled the lid off of the corruption going on in our system, that people were still afraid. People today are afraid to say anything unless it's anonymous if they're a staff member. They're afraid they're going to get fired. They're afraid they're going to face retaliation at work or harassment, possibly physical danger. And Keith and I were talking just last night because I just did a television interview with a CBS station about it, and he's going to interview with the same reporter. And there was an an ABC report just came out where for the first time ever, 3 DOC employees decided to speak, but their voices were masked and they were filmed in shadow, so they're still anonymous. And Keith was saying, why is it that the two of us are the only ones who are willing to say, yes, this is who we are, and we're willing to talk about the corruption? Because I know people worry about getting fired, but if there are 11,000 DOC employees, and if it's as bad as they all know it is, if 5,000 of them stood up and said, yeah, I'll talk about how bad it is, they're not going to fire 5,000 people.
They're not going to fire 5,000, you're right, but a lot of those folks need the money badly, don't they?
We all need jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody needs their job. But if 5,000 people stand up and say, you know what, I'm really sick of this, this is what happens in our system, then change is going to happen. If 500 people did that, we're so short-staffed in our prison system that they can't afford anybody to leave at this point. They're having to close down housing units because there's not enough people to staff them.
Really? Are there 11,000 people to handle the inmates in Missouri is too little?
They have a 35% understaffing.
Wow.
At my husband's prison. They shut down the housing unit that he lived in and moved everybody into other buildings. They're having to have caseworkers do overtime and work as COs. It's ridiculous, and it's like this perfect storm. When she was asking what the causes are for the riots that have been happening in prisons across our state, I told her that there are 100 different straws that are breaking the camel's back, and inmates have valid complaints, and employees have valid complaints and concerns, and the common denominator of all of those is that the DOC leadership has kicked the can down the road on building problems for so long and just denied that there was a problem, that now it's reached a crisis proportion.
What does the title death fences mean?
It's because of the electrified high-voltage fences around the maximum security prisons in Missouri.
So did this take a lot of guts for you to write this?
Oh, I'll have people tell me that I'm brave. I'm determined. Maybe it's bravery, but I'm just determined in shedding light on what's going on in the system. I've had an employee that I've known who still works in the DOC tell me for years that I need to carry a gun because of the stuff that I talk about. But if somebody doesn't speak up, no one's going to know.
Now, have you gotten any threats?
I did when I worked within the system. Nobody has openly threatened me. Now that you're out of the system.
All right. Now you really suffered. You saw corruption, retaliation, death threats, sex harassment. I don't know if you saw drug distribution issues. I know some guys were arrested there. I guess before we go into more detail, give people a sense of the prison culture. You even talk about the smell of the environment.
Yeah. I describe it as being full of anxiety, and it's a hostile workplace environment. And some people would say, well, of course it's a prison, you're working around rapists and killers. But the most hostility came from coworkers and supervisors, and there's this culture of fear among corrections officers that is perpetuated. It's encouraged by the system itself, by the DOC leadership. They'll tell the employees that there are people just waiting to narc on them, and they better be watching over their shoulder, and you better be watching the guy working next to you so you can report on him too. And it's a divide and conquer method that keeps everybody feeling so isolated and afraid that they either miss the big picture or they just put blinders on and they just want to get through their days.
So that is actually a worse environment than the threat of violence from inmates and things like that?
Oh, definitely. Because, for one thing, as staff, you had power to send somebody to the hole. If you were being threatened by an inmate, you could send them to the hole. if your supervisor or your coworker is the person who's making your life hell. There wasn't too much you could do about it, especially if they had been in the system for a long time and were ingrained. I had a lot of issues with the school secretary, which might sound strange, but she was very vindictive and she was very cutthroat and she was very harassing and bullying and had driven people away before, and she set her sights on me. And it was ironic because the DOC was going through this anti-bullying phase, and they had posters up all over, and there was a poster against bullying right outside her office, which I thought was ironic because she was the person I was having the most trouble with.
Tell people what the hole is.
That's administrative segregation. That's where inmates are put if they've been written up and are being punished. They're separated from general population, put in the hole where it's a really nasty place to be.
In fact, when the scandal, in quotes, came out about you and Keith, they stuck him there, right?
Yeah, actually it had more to do with the fact that I had blown the whistle on the major who was doing some unprofessional practices, including trying to blackmail the entire teaching faculty. Yeah, he told us that if we wanted to complain about the way he operated and the things he did, that was fine. We could do that, but he wanted us to know that he had collected damning information on each and every one of us, and he would use it against us if we complained. He told us that in a meeting in front of the entire faculty.
Now, we're down to about 2 minutes in this segment. You talking here about the wardens and the guards lying all the time and for no basic reason even.
Yes. Wardens, for example, the head warden at SCCC, where I work, South Central Correctional Center, told us at a staff meeting, a training that I was at, that low morale had been caused by drug runners in the system, and that not to worry, that 7 dirty employees had just been caught selling drugs, and they had been fired, so everything was going to be great now. The thing is nobody could identify those 7. No employee turned up missing, so it was just completely a lie. And low morale wasn't because of COs bringing in drugs anyway. And guards will lie to inmates all the time. They'll spread rumors pretty much for entertainment, just to watch it spread.
And it's effective, too, right? Because they believe that. I know you'd give examples. There'd be lockdowns for some reason, but they would turn it into either violence, or they'd make up reasons to keep people on edge, I guess. Yeah,
they would. And some of the things that they would tell them were actually detrimental to staff. One lockdown that they had, they told the inmates that it was because the shift before them, the midnight shift, had screwed things up so badly that the whole camp was on lockdown, and it had nothing to do with that. There was an emergency preparedness drill that had gone on. And so why undermine the authority of the midnight shift and say that they were so incompetent that it messed up the entire schedule? Why do that? The only thing staff had going for it was that level of respect and authority because they were staff. If other staff's even saying that you're incompetent, the inmates are going to take advantage of that.
Listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back at our next segment. We'll go into more detail of some of the abuse suffered by Carolyn in the Missouri prison. From Philly to Fresno, Brooklyn to Boston, Data Cable Superstars has the best prices on installation of Cat 5 and Cat 6 wiring for cameras, computers, phone, and data, specializing in off-peak installs as to not interrupt your workflow. If this is an I need it done yesterday situation, then it's time to call Data Cable Superstars at 203-942-1427 or go to datacablesuperstars.com. That's Data Cable Superstars, all one word, .com. Data Cable Superstars, where estimates and big ideas are always free. Now we're back with Carolyn Giammanco. The book is Inside the Death Fences, a memoir of a whistleblower. Now, let me ask you this before we get into individual types of incidents. The education function there, I assume, was designed to fix these guys so they could go out and re-enter the world and be successful, not come back to prison. Was that the goal of the program, or did the leadership of the system there undermine it?
Well, the goal of the education department was to rehabilitate inmates, and it falls under a different branch of the Department of Corrections. It fell under the Department of Offender Rehabilitative Services, as opposed to the guards, which fell under the custody branch of the system. And the custody officers did not support rehabilitation efforts. They actually treated us and looked at us as though we were a thorn in their side. They saw us as being soft on inmates and everything. No, we were just trying to make sure these people followed through with the state-mandated requirement that if they didn't have their GED, or if they didn't have their GED already, or if they didn't have their high school diploma, that we would help them get their GED. We would make sure that they were literate by the time they left prison. And there was actually quite a bit of blowback from custody, just the way we were treated, that we were undermining their efforts to punish people because they thought that's what they were there for.
And you guys were unprotected, essentially, right?
Yeah, there was one guard. Sometimes in the afternoons there were two guards, but they stayed 95% of the time up at the guard station in front. And teachers were alone in our classroom with 15 students, 2 inmate employees. There were 10 teachers. So we were pretty much all on our own, and we just hoped that everybody kept order in their classroom, because if it broke out, we were going to have to deal with things pretty much on our own.
Wow. And did violence break out periodically, or?
Periodically, yeah. There were some pretty good fights that broke out. One of them happened in the room next to me, and my classroom 10 and classroom 9 next door, were the only ones that had one of those accordion-type walls, that are just plastic, basically. And that's all that separated us. And a fight broke out in that room, and the guys who were fighting actually were up against the wall, and it was bowing in. And I got up and was leaving, and I know some of the guys in my class were like, "What, ma'am, are you afraid?" I said, "No, I know that Mr. Rogers has pepper spray, and if they come through that wall, he's spraying them." And they were like, "Oh," and they all started backing up too.
Do you think these guys were fixable through education?
A lot of them, yeah, and not just education. That's the problem, is we can't just put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound and think that it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. What's disappointing is with all the resources that we put into corrections, we spend $710 million a year in our state.
Wow.
To incarcerate 33,000 inmates, as opposed to spending $1 billion to educate 1 million school-age kids in our state.
Wow.
So 70% of what we spend on education, we spend on just keeping 33,000 people in prison. You would think with those kinds of resources, they would try to rehabilitate them. It should happen the first day that someone walks into prison, but that's not the way it is. That's not what happens.
All right,
so I think it's a waste of opportunity, because at no time has society had more say-so over changing someone. I'm a teacher, so maybe 50 minutes a day, 5 times a week, I have an influence on my students. The state has those people literally as a captive audience, and they could be doing intense programs, but they don't. And
in fact, we've had on our show some of the reform efforts in the Nordic countries in particular, where their whole goal is to get these guys back into society. U.S.
and it works.
Yeah, it works, and the U.S. seems to be lagging as the rest of our.
And one of the worst reasons I've heard from people as to why we shouldn't follow the Nordic, procedures is they say, "Well, but we're such a diverse country that would never work over here. We're not homogenous like they are."
Yeah.
Which is like saying that only if you're white can you be rehabilitated, which I find really offensive.
Yeah. Let's hear some of these stories now. This guy Ellison threatened to kill you. Talk about that.
Yes. He was in my second session class, and he had a habit of spouting off about things. But one day he came in, and he was really on a roll. He was saying that all law enforcement should be killed, all COs, all police officers, we should kill them. And I told him, stop. And he wouldn't stop. And I told him 4 times. And he said, well, I'm just, expressing my opinion. I've got freedom of speech. And I said, well, you can't express that opinion in my class. You need to stop. And he kept on, got a couple of other guys to say, yeah, that's right, we should. Well, I wrote him up for trying to incite a riot, even though he wasn't specifically talking about any particular corrections officer. So he immediately started, when I went to the hole, because I had to go there while his violation was being read, as soon as the officer was done reading, Ellison started going off and screaming at me, saying, you're going to die, bitch. I'm going to find you on the walk. I'm going to find you in your classroom. You better go home and tell your children goodbye because you're going to die. And I thought, okay, that's scary, but he'll probably calm down and that'll be the end of it. But that's not what happened. And months went by, and they wouldn't transfer him. I had put in a request for him to be transferred right away. He wasn't transferred, and this continued for a few months. And I finally asked my boss, hey, I've got a training up in Jefferson City. How about if I talk to one of the trainers that we knew for some advice, because he started at the same time I did. So he wasn't quite sure if this was normal or not. And so he said, yeah, I think that's a good idea. So I talked to one of the trainers we'd had, and the trainer said, I'm going to look into this. I'll get to the bottom of it. This isn't right. You should be afraid. He should already be off the camp. And 2 days later, my supervisor called me in his office and told me to sit down. He had a message for me from the wardens, and I said, okay. And they told him that if I ever went out of house with the situation again, it would be my job.
Well, why do you think they wouldn't want to transfer the guy? What reason would they have to allow him to hang around and threaten to kill people?
I have absolutely no idea. There are different scenarios as to why. First of all, I was a teacher, so they didn't value me as much. It didn't really matter to them as custody that a teacher was being threatened, which was ironic since he made a general threat against corrections officers, so I wrote him up. But when he was specifically saying he wanted to kill me, they didn't want to do anything. And, I mean, sometimes as you find out inside the death census, as you read, certain high-powered people have certain inmate pets. They have people who are their strong arms or their drug runners, and they protect them to make sure that nothing happens to them. And I was so new to the system, I didn't even think about something like that, but that's another possibility, is that he was valued by somebody on that camp who didn't want him to be gone.
Drug runners from staff point of view?
Yeah, as far as, employees bringing in drugs, and then there are drug dealers on the prison camps.
Wow, does that happen?
Inmates.
Does that happen a lot?
Oh, yeah.
And do these guys get caught?
There are overdoses that happen all the time inside the prison system. And, drugs coming in through the visiting room. No, they're not. I mean, people are searched so thoroughly, far more thoroughly than employees are when they are sent through. So it's coming in through crooked employees.
Wow. Now, if when you write up a guy like you did Ellison, it seemed like the procedure, the way you described it, is pretty much they automatically go in the hole.
Yeah.
Which did not happen. Which did not happen here.
He went to the hole.
Oh, he did go to the hole. Okay.
Yeah, he went to the hole, but I wanted him transferred off of the prison camp.
Now,
and we have 22 different prison sites in Missouri, so they could have else for him to be.
And he was eventually transferred, right?
Eventually. But it was only after the trainer, who was well respected, and the DOC as a whole got involved.
And intervened. Do you think he was serious about trying to have you killed?
Yeah, he was. I actually had other students who, weren't just trying to scare me or anything, guys would come into my classroom and say, "Hey, ma'am, there's this guy in D-Wing in the hole. I just got out of the hole. There's this guy. He will not stop saying he's going to kill you and rape you. I think he's serious. We tried telling him, talking crazy like that's not going to do you any good. Stop saying stuff like that." But he was just completely intent on killing me.
Now, all the rumors that were swirling around about you and Keith, and then you had a workman's comp issue on when you tore your ACL, and when you finally quit, they put you in bad standing. Do you think there was just like a giant campaign against you?
I think that, I know I was targeted. But I'd like to say that I was an isolated incident, but it's the way the department operates. That's why people are afraid to speak up and come forward about things, because they don't want that happening to them. So was I specifically targeted? Yes, I was. And did they look for ways to make life hell for me and push me out? Yeah, they did. But they do that to lots of people. To
good people, essentially, it sounds like.
Yeah.
This guy, Kessler, I assume was an inmate, and you describe him as almost running the education department through intimidation, and that one of the wardens asked you to provide info on him, and then he was working for her eventually.
Yeah. Major, remember how I said that there were different divisions, that education was under a different branch of the Department of Corrections than custody was?
Yep.
Well, the major was the head of custody. He was on the camp. He was the head of a totally different department or branch than what education was. And suddenly he decided, when we needed a new porter or janitor, that he was going to say we needed to hire this particular inmate, Kessler, which raised flags. Why is somebody coming into our division and telling us who to hire? So red flags went up right away, and immediately this guy started terrorizing the education department. He would threaten people. He would, and not just inmates. He threatened students and inmate employees and teachers, and we were all afraid of him. And nobody would do anything to get rid of him. He was able to come and go as he pleased, which no other inmate was able to do.
Wow.
He bragged about how the major did all kinds of different favors for him. He'd get into fights, and the major would get him out of the hole. He'd never get in trouble. It was a really dangerous situation, because here was this guy who had free reign, and the education officers would even let him, the inmates, sit in their chair drinking coffee while they had to stand in their area. That's just unheard of.
Now, they tried to block your marriage, and then they didn't want a contact wedding. What are you allowed to do now with Keith? Are you allowed to visit him and have contact or not?
No, we are still under the 5-year visiting ban. It's supposed to run out October 24th of this year.
And how do they put a 5-year visiting ban on somebody?
Because they're the DOC, and they can pretty much do anything they want to. And they said that because I was an employee, they were going to put a 5-year ban on us getting to visit, I guess thinking that would break us up, but it didn't. And yet they've done any number of things throughout the years to try to make things difficult, as in denying our wedding because the first time we put in for it because I wasn't on his visiting list. Well, no, I'm not on the visiting list because you guys won't let me on his visiting list. But I also knew one of the advantages of having worked there, I knew that people could still get married even if they weren't on somebody's visiting list. And it actually took me getting a couple of legislators involved, state legislators, to get the marriage to happen. And Jefferson City at the central office had told me in an email that our ceremony would be 30 minutes long. We wouldn't get to have a visit afterwards, but we'd have 30 minutes. Well, we got married on a Monday. The Friday before, at the prison where Keith is now, informed my pastor that the ceremony would only be 15 minutes. And when I called the chaplain to clarify, he said I could make it 10. So they can pretty much do whatever they want to.
All right, we got a couple minutes left. There was also this in the DOC there, the Corrections Department, a drug task force whistleblower named John Griggs, and he ended up getting assaulted, right, for trying to undercover drugs and terrorism stuff.
He did, and you can find out more about John's situation by going to the Pitch articles. The Pitch is a Kansas City news outlet, and you can go to thepitch.com. And John's life was seriously in danger. He was cornered by two knife-wielding inmates after he had uncovered some serious illegal activity going on and had reported it to outside sources. They tried to have him killed in the prison.
All right. Now, this woman was brought in from North Carolina, Camilla Mosley. She'd reformed the North Carolina impact. She was an outsider. They talked about retraining some of these 11,000. Has she been effective? Has she done anything?
Okay, I'd like to point out that in the book, all those names are made up. Just so you know, they're real people, but they're made-up names.
Okay.
Our new DOC director, I had high hopes for her because she came in, like you said, from North Carolina and was supposed to make these sweeping changes in the DOC after the former director resigned in shame and the second in command resigned in shame after some of the stuff was uncovered, like I said, by the pitch, and then the House of Representatives here had a subcommittee formed to investigate. And from what I hear from employees I still know in the system, and I know people all across the state, things are actually in some ways worse now that she's in. And I tried meeting with her. I met with her in person, tried telling her, hey, I want to help make the system better. This is not about me just having something to complain about or grandstand. I want the system to run the way it should. And she dismissed me and said there wasn't anything I could tell her that she didn't know until I started telling her some things that she didn't know, and she started scribbling notes down. But she has not done the things that she said she was going to do. Like, she has not improved things the way she was supposed to. And one thing that was disappointing with the subcommittee is the first year they had lots of people come in and testify. This year, I was like, great, they're going to have the subcommittee reconvene. They had two hearings, one at the beginning of the session, one at the end of the session, and each time they had one witness, and that was the new director. And she just talked rainbows and butterflies about how wonderful everything was and about how they had an 80% change in leadership in the DOC. All they did was shuffle one warden to another camp and around. It was a reshuffling of the same people, so it wasn't really an 80% leadership change.
All right, we'll be back with our final segment. Carolyn Giammanco, Whistleblower, Missouri Prison System, right after this. Carolyn Giammanco, ex-prison teacher turned whistleblower. What are the broad prison culture reforms that are needed? I mean, right now there's a feeling that rehabilitation is not even a goal. What has to be done to change the culture, the hopelessness, the anger and violence inside?
It all starts at the top of the DOC, and they need to eliminate people who are corrupt and harassing their coworkers. They need to stop poking sticks at inmates, and people go, well, I want to see them punished. If we want people to come out into our communities and we're safer because they had been in prison, we don't want to make them more dangerous because they were in prison. There needs to be a wholehearted change in how they treat inmates, how they treat staff members. I would never go to my teaching job in public school and harass or intimidate a coworker. I mean, that's just craziness. That would get me fired immediately, or anybody else, right?
Yeah.
But as a teacher, I'm not allowed to go to my coworkers in public school and harass and intimidate them. They're not allowed to do that to me, but that happens every day inside the Department of Corrections. And people will say, well, it's a dangerous, stressful environment, and that's true, but just because you work in a stressful environment doesn't mean that you should behave in the worst possible way that you can. I understand that it's not a pleasant job all the time, but you can't make other people miserable or seek entertainment by making other people miserable just because you don't like your job.
Now, you talk in the book about these are in rural areas, a lot of them. The folks are desperate for jobs. They're very underpaid. I think $29,000 or something is the average. They have a lot of fear. Does that need to be changed in any way, and could it be changed in any way?
It can be changed. I know that the Department of Corrections would say they just need a whole bunch more money thrown at them so that they can pay people more. as I had said earlier, they need to use their resources more wisely and use them towards rehabilitation. I know that's going to be costly up front, but in the long run, it'll be cheaper. And when asked by a couple of legislators if I thought pay raises were the answer, first of all, in the long run, pay raises will be a good thing. In the future, pay raises are important. But the sinister elements have to be removed. Otherwise, you're just giving more money to people who are operating in the same corrupt way.
The next steps for Keith, discuss that.
We are going to be able to send in an application for an appeal to the 8th court in the federal level after this federal appeal was denied. We don't know how that's going to go. I mean, as we've said before, it's a very thin chance on appeals. We are working on a clemency effort here in Missouri, and if people would like more information, they can go to Free Keith Giammanco on Facebook.
Okay,
or contact me.
Spell Giammanco. Spell Giammanco for folks.
Giammanco.
Now yourself, what are you doing now, and have you had any trouble, finding work, etc.?
I am a public school teacher, and I have had some issues in the past with people not being very thrilled about me being married to an inmate. The stigma is a really rough thing for anyone who's got an inmate family member to deal with.
The twin girls, were they hit hard by the appeal rejection?
They were. They're disappointed. I mean, I think we all pin our hopes on that chance. We try to be optimistic that something's going to come through, and it was a blow to the girls.
I know you had a son badly wounded in Afghanistan. How are your sons doing, and are they involved in the case in any way, or Keith's a stepfather and they haven't really had a chance to build a relationship, etc.?
They live in Tennessee, and, they're adults. They haven't had a whole lot of time. My oldest son will talk to Keith on the phone whenever I happen to be there or when Keith calls them. So they're not as involved in this as the girls are.
Now, you were pretty down before you met Keith. Your first marriage was going down, and you even contemplated suicide. How's your morale right now, and how do you sustain it?
It's pretty good. It was disappointing to find out about the appeal, and having Keith in prison is difficult on a day-to-day basis, but I'm in a much better place than I was.
What do you see?
Than what I wrote about.
What do you see Keith doing or wanting to do, or both of you wanting to do, when he gets out in 10 years max, 7.5 if he gets paroled?
Well, first of all, we're going to continue working on criminal justice reform and keep being voices for change and improvement in the way our criminal justice and penal systems work. Other than that, we're just going to keep moving forward, building life, working, spending time with our families.
And how much contact do you have with them now? You talk on the phone every day?
Yeah, I talk with Keith every day on the phone, 3 or 4 times a day. They only let us have 20 minutes at a time every couple of hours, so it's limited. And we write to each other all the time. Do
the prison monitor the phone calls and the letters?
Oh, yeah. They listen in on our phone conversations, and they read every one of our letters. That's just what happens. There's a mailroom at the prison where people go through and read inmate mail, and sometimes we can even hear people on the line when we're talking.
And you don't sense, though, that he's had direct blowback from your actions outside of the prison? No,
actually, and Keith always speaks up, too. He's done interviews with you and other people, so he speaks up, too, and we actually kind of feel, and we felt this way right from the beginning, that if we stand up in the sunshine and talk out loud and make people aware of what's going on, in a way we're actually safer, because if we were quiet and nobody knew who Keith Giammanco was, or they didn't know the things that we're bringing awareness to, something could happen to him, and it would all be in the shadows and would just be overlooked by society. But now I've got people watching who are aware that he's there. And so I think sunshine is better than staying in the shadows.
Okay, last question. Do you think that if Keith and you were successful in criminal justice reform, he'll end up looking back at this whole thing from the bank robbery through prison as a positive thing in his life because of the impact that you guys ended up making? Yeah,
I mean, I think we would. If I had a way of going back in time and stopping him from robbing banks in the first place, I certainly would. I wouldn't want any of us to go through what we have. But as I used to tell students in my inmates in my classroom, I would say, as bad as this prison sentence is, focus on becoming a better you, going out and having a better life than you did before. I tell them that it's kind of like getting a cancer diagnosis. Nobody wants to be told they have cancer, but if you survive it, it gives you an appreciation for life that you didn't have before.
Well, nice way to end it. What's the website again people can go to?
It's a Facebook page. They can go to Free Keith Giammanco on Facebook. They can contact me at Caroline Giammanco Author. That's my Facebook account. And they can get in touch with us.
All right, another fast hour with Caroline. We'll stay in touch with this case. Inside the Death Fences, a memoir of a whistleblower, is her latest book. This has been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Podcast available on YouTube. Search Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell or Park City Productions 06604. And we'll see everybody next Monday evening at 6 p.m. for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.